So I'm part of the scientific steering committee of human energy, and the topic I want to speak about now is one that was already briefly mentioned by my former PhD student Clément Vidal yesterday. It is the famous third story. So that third story is the way that human energy tries to provide people with a sense of meaning. But why do we need that sense of meaning? It is because of what human energy has called the Techno-Social Dilemma. And to put it very bluntly, the Techno-Social Dilemma is a kind of a mental health crisis, especially here in the US, especially among students and undergraduates. And it is, you might say, a sudden explosion in a very short time of anxiety, depression, despair, meaninglessness, gloom and doom. According to a recent survey, more than 50% of young people in the world believe that humanity is doomed. So this is a pretty big thing, and we want first to understand why there is this crisis, and second, of course, we want to do something about it. Now, I've just been writing a long paper, which still is under review, on the causes, so I'm not going to go into detail here, but some people have already indicated that social media definitely play a pretty bad role in there, in the fact that they flood people with incoherent, fragmented information that is typically negative, that is typically very emotionally loaded, that is typically incoherent. And more generally, what people suffer from is what has been called the VUCA world, where VUCA stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So I think everybody understands that we are living in a world that is much more complex and much more fragmented and much more difficult to understand than it used to be. So that alone already explains why there is this techno-social dilemma. But let's look into a little bit more detail to show how bad it really is. Here you see how the rates of different psychopathologies have gone up among US undergraduates, and note that it starts about 2010 and that it ends 2019, that means before COVID. So I'm pretty sure if you would have more updated graphics, it would have gone even further to the roof. So you see here that like 25% of students suffer from anxiety, 20% suffer from depression, and all that has increased suddenly since 2010. Why 2010? Well, there's a psychologist, Jonathan Haidt, together with Jean Twenge, who have done research about them, and their interpretation is that it's mostly because in 2010, young people started using smartphones and social media. But so, what I'm going to speak about here is not so much the causes of the crisis, but more what can we do about it. And there's a very interesting concept that was proposed by a medical sociologist called Antonovsky, and that is called the sense of coherence. So what Antonovsky did is he interviewed many different people who had gone through all kinds of very difficult things, diseases, the Holocaust, being prisoner, so people who really had gone through traumas, and he noticed that there were roughly two categories of people, those who were traumatized for life and those who recovered and led a healthy, productive life afterwards. And what was the difference between those two groups? Namely that the constructive, the positive group had what he called a sense of coherence. And in my analysis, the techno-social dilemma is the opposite of a sense of coherence. The techno-social dilemma means that people have lost their sense of coherence. So what we want to do is we want to give people again that sense of coherence. So the sense of coherence, the more people have that, the less they are anxious, the less they are depressed, the less they feel meaningless. So what is this sense of coherence? According to the analysis of Antonovsky, it has three components. The comprehensibility means people have a general kind of understanding of how the world functions and how they fit into that world. Manageability means that people have the feeling that they have the necessary skills and resources to act in that world, to achieve things. And then also meaningfulness, not only they can achieve things, but they have things to achieve, that they want to achieve, that they consider meaningful, that they consider valuable, that they consider purposeful. In my own research, building on another tradition, the one of the philosopher Leo Apostel, after which the center that I direct is named, there we speak about a worldview, an integrated worldview, and it is, in a sense, a bit kind of an elaboration of the sense of coherence. So what we do is we take the first component, the comprehensibility, and we subdivide it in 4 aspects. Comprehending the world means that you have an idea of what's going on at this moment. It means that you have an idea of why things are like that, where does it come from, that you have an idea of where it is going to, that you have some ability to anticipate or to extrapolate towards the future, but also that you have some idea of how much do I know, because you can think that you understand it very well, but actually have very misleading information. So you should also have an idea of how can I get reliable knowledge. And then the manageability component in the worldview framework, we call it action. That means you have a theory of action, you know what kind of actions you can perform. And then the meaningfulness is what in the worldview framework is called value or purpose. What is important? What should I strive for? So here is a scheme that a little bit summarizes the whole sense of coherence. So it has the 6 components. Below, there is the meaningfulness component, the manageability component, and these are the 4 comprehensibility components. This is another scheme that I made earlier that puts it a little bit in the cybernetic framework. I am a person or subject. I'm interacting with some phenomenon or object. Interacting means that I can act on it, means that I can acquire knowledge about it, but it means that also I have some values that tell me how should I interact, what are the things I should do, and if I want to do these things, I should have an idea of where does it come from, what is it, and what's going to happen next. So why do we need this third story? As I said, we live in this VUCA world, this very complex, confusing world. We need this integrated world, and that integrated worldview, it needs ideally to take the form of a story, because stories are much more intuitive. People empathize more with stories, they understand them well. You don't want to give them a philosophical treatise about the structure of the world. So in the formulation of human energy, which I copied from the website, human energy was founded to share a new scientific story, introducing the Noosphere and third story as a source of meaning for future generations in our globalizing world. So why do we need a third story? Well, because there are already existing stories, what we call the first story and the second story, but these existing stories are not sufficient. So the first story, as Clément yesterday already a little bit explained, it's a traditional religious worldview which you find in things like the Bible or the Quran or in different kind of mythologies. It's typically a nice story with lots of protagonists, and typically there is some gods or some deities that have created the world and then have created people in a particular order in order to do certain things. So it's a nice story, but it tells you that is the way things are, that is how you should behave. It doesn't give you any choice. It's kind of imposed from above. You just have to take it or leave it. Rather, or in some cases, you're not allowed to leave it. So that's a typical depiction of the first story, the most famous painting about the creation of Adam by God, Michelangelo. So the first story, it has the advantage, it provides some form of understanding of the universe and of people. It provides meaning, it provides values, it gives you do's and don'ts, things you should do, things you shouldn't do. But what are the shortcomings? Well, we know that these stories are no longer compatible with the way we understand the world through science. We know that God did not suddenly create humanity. We knew that humanity evolved through millions of years out of animals and that the universe is much older than in those stories. these stories also do not make reliable predictions. They will not tell us what's going to happen with AI or with humanity or with global warming. And they have values that are universal, like you should not murder people, but they also have some values that are outdated. For example, that people who do not believe the dogmas of that religion should be punished. So then we come to the second story. The second story is the traditional scientific worldview, the kind of worldview that people who know a little bit of science kind of assume is the scientific worldview. It's actually a worldview that developed mostly during the 19th century and that started to become outdated with the 20th century. But that scientific worldview, it's kind of simple, it's also kind of intuitive, because what it does is it sees the world as a collection of material objects. These material objects, they move through space and time according to the so-called laws of nature. That means there is a movement, but the movement is completely determined. So the idea in the traditional scientific worldview is that any phenomenon, love, life, mind, is reducible to these material objects, typically particles that are moving through space and time, and that's all you need to know. Everything is particles moving in space and time, and the way they move, it's fixed. The laws of nature don't leave any freedom. So it's the clockwork universe. It's often seen as a clockwork. So the typical example of such a clockwork movement is the way the planets move around the sun. These planets move in very regular trajectories. You can predict exactly, knowing where the position of a planet is now, where it will be 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, 1 million years from now. That is this clockwork idea. Here is a kind of clockwork model of the planetary systems, where you see the sun in the middle, and then all the different gears and wheels make that when you turn the handle, all of the planets will move in the right way. The system does not have any freedom. It does not have any goals. So that is the shortcoming of the second story. It does not provide values or meaning. It just describes, it says, that's the way things are. If they couldn't be otherwise, you don't have any choice, so you are determined, being goal-directed, searching for meaning, all that is useless. Things are just one big clockwork. So people in there, they are like these material objects. They are being pushed around by forces that they don't understand. It's like little billiard balls. You hit one billiard ball with your cue, the ball will move in a well-defined direction and stop at a well-defined point. You don't have any choice. And this understanding was expressed by Nobel Prize winner in physics, Steven Weinberg, that the more the universe seems comprehensible, and by comprehensible he means the more we can have all these exact equations that describe all these movements of all these particles, the more it seems pointless. Yes, indeed. That's why we need a third story, and a third story that means what I call the contemporary scientific worldview. It's a worldview where the world is not this clockwork that just moves around but doesn't change. It's a world in which the cosmos arises step by step, what my colleague Brian Swim calls cosmogenesis. So I'm not going to repeat the steps of the evolution, but we know that there was a Big Bang, which is the origin of space and time. Then we had elementary particles. Out of elementary particles, you get atoms, molecules, cells, organisms, human beings, mind societies, and finally the noosphere. What's remarkable about this worldview is that we see that evolution is directional. It goes in the direction of more complexity and, to paraphrase Teilhard, also more consciousness. Teilhard formulated the so-called law, which is not really a law, but it's a nice principle that complexity and consciousness together grow in evolution. So let me explain that in a little bit a more modern scientific way. Here is one of the typical schemes of how evolution has happened. I don't have the time to go into any details, but you can find that in any textbook. What I want to go is, what are the underlying principles of this worldview? So evolution, to start with, it's not deterministic. We cannot really predict what will happen. There is no fixed goal, there is no endpoint to which everything is going. But there is this directionality. That means not all outcomes are equal. Some outcomes have an implicit preference. There is something like a preference of nature for certain outcome over other outcomes, and that we can understand through the basic mechanism of evolution, variation and selection. We speak often about blind variation. What does that mean? That the variation does not know where it is going. Variation can go in any direction. But then we have selection. That means that all those that went in the supposedly wrong direction are eliminated. Those that went in the right direction are kept. So that imposes a kind of directionality. And what is a directionality? It's a directionality towards what is called fitness. It's the idea of the survival of the fittest. Fit systems are preferred over unfit systems. So we go towards more fitness. But now many people misunderstand this fitness. Survival of the fittest, it's kind of this idea of nature that in tooth and claw, it's kind of the idea of fighting, the strongest one survives. That's not how evolution works. Fitness is relational. That means to be fit, it's not a question of being strong or being dominant. It's a question of fitting in with your environment. That means to be adapted to your environment. That environment consists itself of other systems. And what fitting in means is developing fit relationships, minimizing conflict or friction, maximizing synergy. So this is a kind of a depiction of how it could happen. You have two things that are randomly moving. At a certain moment, they fit together. And once they fit together, they stay together. It's like two atoms bumping into each other, and at a certain moment, they form a chemical bond and they form a molecule. So the concept that I think is best to explain it is the concept of synergy. Synergy means that together you can do more than alone. It is what has been called a positive sum or a win-win situation. Two or more components interact in such a way that all of them are doing better together than they would have been doing alone. And what does it mean, doing better together? Because we're speaking about fitness, it means surviving, growing, developing better. So a few simple examples. That's another example I got from Brian. A neutron is a particle we find in the nucleus of an atom. Well, neutrons on their own are unstable, they fall apart. But if they are together with a proton in an atom, there are certain quantum mechanical principles that make that the neutron cannot disintegrate. So the neutrons are there only because they are coupled to the protons in the nucleus. The example of a molecule, we know that table salt, sodium chlorine, consists of two elements, sodium and chlorine. Sodium and chlorine on their own are very unstable elements. You better not swallow them because you probably wouldn't survive. But put them together and they form this stable molecule of table salt, which we are constantly having in our body all the time. Another example from biology is what is called mutualist symbiosis. Two or more organisms living together in such a way that they both profit. And finally, with people, synergy means cooperation. You cooperate because together you can do things that you can't do alone. So here's an example of one of these symbioses. A coral is a colony of polyps, but these polyps, intrinsically, they have algae, unicellular algae living inside the polyps. Why is that? Because the algae, they can photosynthesize, they can extract food from carbon dioxide in the water, which the polyps can't do. Vice versa, the polyps provide protection to the algae. So finding synergy then is the main dynamic of evolution, but it's easier said than done. Most combinations of systems are not synergetic, so you need to find one. You need to find one when there is a positive sum. That means you need to try out many different interactions with many different systems until you find one where both or more partners profit. So that's you need local interactions. Now, sometimes the process can accelerate, and that's typically what we call self-organization. You have a number of components. Some of them start fitting in, and then they all align. I won't have the time to go into this, but people who have seen other talks of me will recognize this slide. It's one of my favorite simple examples. All the little arrows represent magnets, small magnets that are pointing in different directions. Now, because magnets repel each other if they point opposite, this is an unstable configuration, but if you put enough variation into it, the magnets will eventually align and all point in the same direction, which means that they are helping each other, they are multiplying their magnetic field, and they make that the whole thing gets magnetized. Here is a photo that I took where there were just some pieces of wood floating in the water. The wind was driving them together, purely random process, but you see the pieces, eventually they align because it's a more synergetic arrangement than if they would all point in different directions. Yet another example I often give is called Bénard convection. You heat a liquid from below. Initially, the water molecules are moving in random directions. What happens is that they start aligning and they start forming these convection cells, which you see here from above. It's an example typically of self-organization. So what's important now is that if you have different components that come together, they align, they form a whole. They form now a system, they are coupled, and that system typically has properties that the components do not have, what are called emergent properties. So an example I often give is, what's a car? A car is an arrangement of lots of different material elements, motors, wheels, steering wheels, etc. But what's the important property of a car? That it can drive, and it can drive with a certain maximum speed. None of these components on its own can drive or has anything like a maximum speed. Maximum speed is an emergent property that you get when you put all the components together in a synergetic way. So what you get typically is you start with a number of individual systems. They form these kind of linkages, and then if the linkages become strong enough, they form a higher order system. And that leads us to the typical architecture of complexity, which is a hierarchy. That is that you have systems within supersystems, and the systems themselves contain subsystems, and the subsystems themselves contain subsystems, and so on. So you have this whole hierarchy of complexity. Here's another typical example. You start with an atom, you go to a molecule, macromolecule, organelle, etc. You go to the whole organism. You can go above the organism to the groups, to the societies, to the planet, etc. So what we see here is a growth of complexity by putting a number of components together that align, develop synergy. You create a higher order system. In that higher order system, now your components are integrated, but by being together in this higher order system, they also help each other, which now means that they can afford to differentiate. They can start to specialize so that each will specialize in a particular function. So actually you increase the diversity, and that's what you typically see in ecosystems. An ecosystem is one huge network of mutually dependent plants, animals, geological forces, etc. But because the one provides the resources for the other, they can afford to differentiate and to increase in biodiversity. Now I come to the little bit more tricky aspect of consciousness. Why do we need consciousness? In a sense, even the simplest systems, they interact with their environment. That means if they want to adapt to that environment, they should at least be able to sense that environment. And ideally not just to sense it, but to make sense of it. They should be able to interpret what's in their environment in order to choose the most synergetic interaction. And that requires some form of cognition, intelligence, awareness. Of course, when we're speaking about atoms that cognition is about non-existing. When we speak about bacteria, it's pretty simple. If we speak about people, it's getting quite sophisticated. So this is a slide I took from the work of Michael Levin, who called these cognitive boundaries, or what I might call a cone of consciousness. In the middle here is your system, which may be a person, and that cone extends towards the future. You are aware to some degree of what may happen in the future. You have a memory to some degree of what has happened in the past, and you have some sense of what's going on around you. So it's a kind of a cone in space-time that gives you the extent of your awareness or your consciousness. So now you can, of course, look at different systems. Take a very simple system like a tick, and its cone will be very small. Take a dog, it will already be more aware. Take a human, it will be even more aware, and maybe there are AIs that have very differently shaped cones. But what's interesting is that if you put different cones together, that means you put different cells together, the cells together have more of an awareness because they share information. Put a number of organisms together in a colony. The colony, again, has a wider awareness, a bigger cone of consciousness than the individual organisms. So that's the idea that when systems start to couple, they extend their consciousness because the information flows from the one to the other, so the one can warn the other about something outside. And that is the essence of complexity and consciousness. Is the more complex the system becomes, the more conscious it can afford to be. For example, our brain is so conscious because it's also very complex, because it has all these different neurons which pass on signals between each other. And ideally in society, we are also aware of much more than our immediate neighborhood, because society propagates information, and ICT in particular has very strongly widened this range of information we get. So these are not a few more slides from Michael Levin, where he's speaking about cells, that the cells, by getting together in a multicellular organism, they become, in a sense, aware of what's going on outside because they exchange electrical or chemical signals. So then we come to the noosphere, which is our latest and strongest way of exchanging information and thus of extending our consciousness. But then the question is, how good is that consciousness in the noosphere? And there are obvious problems. So humanity is self-organizing into this global superorganism, and we might say at the metabolic level, that means at the level of energy, goods, food, it's pretty efficient. There are flows of goods across the globe, and even something like the pandemic hardly managed to disturb these flows. People here did not get hungry because of the shops closing because of the pandemic. The logistic infrastructure, the metabolism is working pretty well, but at the level of the consciousness, we have some problems. So the global brain, at the level of science, it works pretty well. At the level of the noosphere in general, especially social media, we see there are these conspiracy theories, polarization, populism, fake news, the Techno-Social Dilemma, all these kind of what I call pathologies of the noosphere. So we need this coherence, and now I come back to what I said in the beginning. The sense of coherence is what would solve the Techno-Social Dilemma. That means it's not enough to receive information because we are bombarded with information. You need to receive information that makes sense, information that you can do something with, information that allows you to build synergetic relationships with others. So information alone is not enough. There needs to be some kind of an organization of that information to make the flow of information much more coherent. We want to avoid all these things that have been called terms like junk information, fake news, mind viruses, data smoke. That is the kind of problem we need to solve at the moment. So in my own theory of consciousness, or rather this is more standard. So in consciousness work, there is a distinction between two types of consciousness. The access consciousness means that some of the things happening in your brain, you are aware of them in the sense that you can examine them, you can report on them, you can say, I am feeling this or I am thinking that. You have access to some parts of what's going on in your brain. Subconscious means things happen in the background, you don't have access to them. So that's one important aspect of consciousness, but then there is the more difficult aspect, the one that has been called phenomenal experience, or sometimes called phenomenal consciousness, or subjective experience, or sometimes also called qualia. That's the aspect of feeling. You're not just aware that something is going on in your brain, you also feel it. You feel the warmth, you feel the pain, you feel the pleasure. And then the question is, what is that feeling? So I have recently been developing a theory called local prospect, for which I don't have the time to go into detail, but I explain this feeling as a form of a local prospect, kind of an expectation of good and bad things that may be happening to you. So that was consciousness in the individual. Now we want to extend it to collective consciousness. So we can again look at those two aspects. The access consciousness, that's simply the collective reflection, the scientific type of discussion, critical thinking. But it's also some of the discussions that are going on in social media, for example, about conspiracy theories. So that's one aspect of the collective consciousness. Then the phenomenal consciousness, that's the aspect of feeling. That's something that Johan Bollen in his talk spoke about a little bit. It's the sentiments, the moods, the emotions, the collective emotions. We can measure them nowadays with some of these modern techniques. And then we see that at the moment, the mood of the noosphere is pretty depressed. So what would then the third story do to enhance collective consciousness? Well, it should restore this sense of coherence. And we define the sense of coherence in this worldview scheme with 6 components. The 6 components give you the equivalent of a global prospect, a kind of a view of things that may happen to you and that may be positive or negative, so that you know how to choose and how to choose the good ones and how to avoid the bad ones. So what are the components in the worldview of the third story? There's a component of the past or the explanation. That is, we go back in the history of evolution, we understand how all these complex things that are happening now, where they come from. Present, we are trying to understand what is going on at this moment. On the one hand, I said the global superorganism functions pretty well on the metabolic level, but is pretty upset on the psychological level, the Techno-Social Dilemma. Future, we want to have at least some positive picture of what may happen to us in the noosphere. Knowledge, we need better methods to create knowledge. Values, that's one of the important aspects of the human energy. We need an ethics of the noosphere. We need to be able to formulate these ideas of synergy, coherence, and consciousness in a way that become more practical, ethical values. And then actions, we need to know which kind of actions are effective at this moment to change something, to achieve things in the noosphere. So what we need to do is we need to change this collective consciousness. We need it to become more coherent. We need to create this sense of coherence. That means we need to teach people to understand how global systems form, what are the long-term trends, show them how they can themselves participate, contribute to these trends, and formulate these noospheric values to give them a guideline, to give them a purpose, to give them a meaning of this is how you can actually contribute in a positive way to this long-term thing. And that, at the same time, while formulating it positively, we will also need to do it negatively. We know that there is a big techno-social dilemma. We will need to fight the techno-social dilemma because we know it creates a lot of stress, confusion, suicides, deaths of despair. So we will need to combat the negative elements. And these negative elements you can see as I call it, pathologies of the noosphere, things like mind viruses, data smoke, information pollution, fake news, all these pathological aspects of the noosphere. And finally, another thing that we should definitely not forget is that people are biological entities that live in a real world. They shouldn't just spend their time with smartphones in the virtual world. They should also reconnect with the real world, with nature. So let me summarize my story. We started with noting that there is a techno-social dilemma. That means that people nowadays are extremely worried, stressed, anxious, depressed, and despairing. We saw that the techno-social dilemma is kind of the equivalent of a lack of a sense of coherence. So we need to restore that sense of coherence. We do that via a third story. And the basic principles of that third story are there is always in nature variation and selection. That variation and selection will lead to systems mutually adapting, creating some form of synergy. That synergy will create emergent properties. The systems with emergent properties will on their own interact with other systems, find more synergy, and like that, the complexity and the consciousness of the whole system is constantly growing. So we know that we are in this kind of a transition phase where the end result hopefully will be a healthy, both physically and mentally healthy superorganism. But at this moment, it's particularly the psychological part, the mental part of the superorganism that is suffering. And so we need to find ways to fight this suffering, to develop a more coherent collective consciousness. So I had a lot of other slides, but maybe I'll just show you a few. The other slides are slides about how we are actually progressing. Most people think that the world is kind of on the border of collapse, but if you look at the actual statistical trends, you see that we are doing quite well. Here are just a few examples. First, these are the number of people that believe the world is getting better. You see that if you go down, it's like 3% or 4% that believe the world is getting better. So here is an example where there's a particular question asked about extreme poverty, and the right answer is the green one. The green one is extreme poverty has diminished. It is diminishing, and on average, 20% of the people know that extreme poverty has diminished, but it has diminished. Even the happiness, this is data for about 12 nations where they made the average. You see, happiness has been increasing until recently. So I haven't yet seen the data for 2020, but I'm afraid that at the moment it's going down again. So we have made progress, and you can make people more happy, but at this moment we are unfortunately in a phase where the happiness is decreasing. But everything else is increasing. Life expectancy is increasing. Deaths from natural disasters are decreasing. I mean, look how big the number of deaths were in the 1920s. Look how few there are now. Global literacy rates are increasing. Average years of education are increasing. Our technology is becoming much more efficient, because that's one of the standard arguments for the collapse. We're saying we're running out of resources, but actually we're needing less and less resources. This smartphone replaces all the things on the left. It uses much less energy, much less power, much less weight. We are doing quite well. Even agriculture, the global cereal yields per hectare. That means we are just making more food with less land. Air pollution is going down. Even, and that is, most people will find this surprising, even the number of lands covered in forests are going up. We all know that there is deforestation in Brazil, in South America. So in South America, you see the orange means the blue is the gross loss. So the blue in South America, the amount of forest is diminishing, but in all the other countries, it's either staying the same or it has gone up. So there is more gain in forest and there is a loss in forest. So overall conclusion, objectively we are doing rather well, but subjectively we feel miserable, we feel desperate. So what the third story is meant to do is to provide a positive narrative of further progress, an updated narrative of progress based on evolutionary principles which are scientifically sound, but which also provide us with meaning and supported by plenty of empirical evidence. This is not just wishful thinking, this is not just some kind of an ideology or some kind of a religion. This is a scientific worldview, and that should help us to restore our sense of coherence, and in that way build up a real noospheric consciousness.
Thank you, Francis, for that wonderful presentation. Invite anybody who has questions to come forward, and as a reminder, just say your name so we can hear who you are and then bring your question forward.
Hello, thank you. Andy Chatburn. I'm curious, as you talk about the increasing coherence and increasing collaboration with this evolution in the third story, if you're familiar with Donna Haraway's multi-symbiote theory as a way of living and dying together in the midst of this story. And if, especially as thinking of us as humans who are multi-symbiotes with our gut bacteria and the gut-brain axis, and how that might have, I'm curious if there's a texture of something that might have something to do with the noosphere.
Yes, I have also written a paper recently that I called Relational Agency, which is an attempt to combine older worldviews like animism with this modern scientific worldview. And what it says is that all systems to some degree are agents, humans, plants, animals, bacteria, technological systems, and all of these systems are mutually interacting and seeking for synergy. So we live together with bacteria in our belly. We are symbiotically living with those bacteria. We are living with the plants that are producing the oxygen that we breathe. So we need to become more aware of this network of synergetic relationships, and that's also part of the ecological point of view, is that we are not just humanity that's exploiting the earth, we are part of this earth, and indeed that fits in with this whole worldview. That is, that synergy extends much more than between people or between technologies. It should encompass the whole earth and all the biological systems on it.
Thank you. Michael Pearson, Fordham University. You say humanity is doing rather well objectively, but feeling increasingly miserable, and a sense of coherence is potentially the solution. I think yesterday we heard something else about the experience of being connected. I wonder how that fits in with the sense of coherence, because it strikes me as rather cognitive and on a knowing dimension.
What do you mean specifically by the feeling of being connected?
Being connected to self, others, and maybe something bigger like the noosphere or the conceptualization. I think Gregory Stock was pointing to the climate crisis as an example, but saying actually what we need to do to solve problems is first be able to connect human to then solve problems. So I'm wondering if this is something that just on top, is that something separate? Does it include the being notion?
Well, it's implicit in the whole view. As I said, I define fitness in a relational way. You are fit because you have connections with others, and these connections are synergetic. There are, of course, also conflictual or frictional connections where two agents are moving in such a way that the one is inhibiting the other. So what you try to do is seek the synergetic connections and avoid the frictional connections. The problem is that at this moment in the noosphere, we find these connections to information, but the information we get is very entropic, it's diffuse, you get all kind of information about all kind of things, typically things you can't do anything about, but that upsets you. So the feeling connected means that you should get the right kind of connections. Finding out which are the things that are really meaningful for me will make me stronger and will make the other one stronger if I collaborate with the other, and that other can be plants, animals, people, nations, organizations. It's this tricky part of finding the synergetic connections and avoiding the fictional connections.
I'm wondering on the aspect of inviting people to sort of contribute towards sort of this third story, because in some sense there seems to be, to me, if I hear about it, some inevitableness towards this complexity. But on the other side, you want to have to make people feel able to contribute. How do you have ideas of how you would make this possible for people to have this feeling that they can also shape and influence this direction of the complexity? Do we need to sort of install certain ways of how people can feel like they can have an influence on this?
Yeah, the feeling aspect is indeed very important. That's also why the third story is formulated as a narrative. That paper I spoke about, the relational agency, it's a scientific paper. It's written for a scientific audience. It may convince people who reason about it. It will not convince people every day. They need something more emotional. And that's why the story is, you want to make it kind of epic. Now, I myself am not the best person to do that, but in Human Energy we have a number of people who are good at that. And Brian Swimmy, for example, he's very good at telling the story of the self-organizing universe and the complexifying universe in a way that is very inspiring, with beautiful images, with nice videos. I think that work is very important to give people really the feeling that they are part of that, not just tell them the story in a dry scientific way. But as I said, that's not my specialty. There are others working on that.
Hi, Wynne Swafford, Eugene, Oregon. I was with you, but I'm concerned about the sixth grade extinction and how that fits into your increasing complexity. I feel like we're riding a fossil fuel bubble that's imperiling us.
Well, I'm very skeptical about the sixth extinction, and if you read serious biologists, they will agree that yes, there are extinctions, yes, there is source of biodiversity, but the sixth mass extinction, the previous mass extinctions was the one with the dinosaurs, where, let's say, 75% of all families, not species, just disappeared. At this moment, there are some snails in this lake and some flowers in this forest and maybe some bugs in this little patch of land that are disappearing. So there are quite some species disappearing, but it's a small percentage of the total number of species. It's not a mass extinction. I mean, just the question I always ask to people who speak about mass extinction, well, tell me which species have been extinguished in the last 20 years, and then they can say, oh, maybe, yeah, and they can come up with 10 or 12, and then say, a mass extinction, that means millions of species disappearing. We have problems with biodiversity, but I don't believe we are on the border of a mass extinction. And in terms of global warming, that is a very serious problem. Yes, we need to work very hard on it. Yes, we need to switch to a different form of energy production. But we have the technology, we have the money to do it. What we need is the sense of coherence. That means the collective consciousness that we are going to do this together in an efficient way, in a coherent, synergetic way, not fighting each other. So in that sense, I think that getting a sense of coherence is more urgent than immediately attacking global warming. Of course, we need to work towards global warming, but we need to do it in a more efficient way than we are doing now. And that means a more coherent, more synergetic way.
Hello, Raphaël Yogier, university professor in France in philosophy and sociology. When we met 1 year ago, you insisted that we really are on the same page. I don't know if you remember. And now I understand you're right, that we are on the same page. Nevertheless, I have 3 remarks, if you allow me, that are not actually in contradiction with what you said. I think has to be discussed, but I think the third story is actually the second one. Because the second story for me is a neurotic regression of our incapacity to accept what you call the third story. Because if you read what happened in the 18th century with all those philosophers, idealist philosophers at the very end of the 17th century, the beginning of the 18th century, and what is called also German idealism, when you don't interpret it from the nihilist point of view, even if you interpret at the end of the 19th century, like someone like Hegel, as we said yesterday, is very close to Teilhard de Chardin. Very, very close. There is this idea. And in fact, there is a fight, kind of a war here from the 18th century to the 19th century onward, where it gave birth to something that expanded positively, that will go to Bergson philosophy and vitalism, the idea of creative evolution and this kind of thing, and even in the US, what is called transcendentalism, and people like Emerson and those kind of people, like this wave of spiritualism and things like that, that were discredited by official philosophy, philosophy of science, the same way Teilhard de Chardin was discredited. So my real question is, why have we chosen nihilism, death, self-destruction philosophy, pure determinism, even if it is even self-contradictory intellectually and logically? Why have we chosen that? And so it's my second remark. And my third remark is I have an hypothesis for that. And I started to have this intuition reading a very small text from a philosopher that I dislike. It's Martin Heidegger, in a series of texts that are called Holzwege. And in the text there is the time of the conceptions of the world. L'époque des conceptions du monde, the time of the conception of the world. And what he says, he said that what is original with modernity, it is that it is not only a new conception of the world, that it is the first time that it sees itself as a conception of the world. If you replace conception of the world with what you say when you say story, there is something new in the second story that is actually another feature that you didn't mention, I think, but that is very important to understand this regression. It is that it sees itself for the first time in human history as a story. So when you see yourself as a story, you say, oh, that's a story that I'm telling. I want to believe in this story. And it's what you actually said. You said, oh, there is this story, this story, this story. But in the traditional world, they don't even will understand what it is to be in a story. Even in the story of pure nihilistic determinism. They don't consider it a story. It's truth. But when you are talking about it, because you are for what you call the third story, in the same time you say, I know it's a story. So what does it do? You know, what does it do? It does that you have a choice. Either you're aware that there are different stories, and you said, statistically, that means that everything is just stories, therefore there is nothing, and let's die, you know? Or you decide something else that is possible, and that's your choice, and that's my choice, and that's our choice, I think, to say, oh, all right, there are different stories. We don't deny that. They are beautiful, the different civilization and all that, but they are not big enough to contain something that is even more important, that we could call the mind or a vital principle or something else. And this time that means they are all right on a certain degree, but not completely. And so we need to trust the future because it's always constructed itself in something more complex that is more and more true. So nothing is completely false. It's just part of the truth. And it's exactly what Teilhard de Chardin did. And in a way, that's what we're doing here. It was just my remark. Thank you.
I think it's very interesting. I haven't made up my mind myself also why the second story became at a certain moment so dominant, but I have always had a big problem with what I call Platonism. Platonism is the idea that mathematical structures are more real than the real world. And I think it is a kind of psychological reaction of being afraid of the messiness of the real world. So you want to have a story that is as clean and as well-defined as possible. And what we call the second story, the Clockwork Universe, is a very clean story. It's everything is determined. You can write it down in equations. The planets move in exactly the right way. Nothing can go wrong. It's a kind of a fear of the uncertainty that leads you to this kind of worldview. So, yeah.
I'm Zan Gill, and I resonate with everything you said. I wanted to suggest an extension, which I think ties into the big prospect of the noosphere and a way of implementing this big idea of the third story. And that is, you talk about evolution in what we conventionally view, which mainstream science sees the mechanism as random variation and natural selection and survival of the fittest. And it is good to see that after some 200 years of excommunication from the scientific community, that Jean-Baptiste Lamarck is being brought back in the context of developmental biology and the rise in understanding of epigenetics, and the importance of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck and the idea of transformism as a complementary view is, and of course there's much thinking on this, diverse thinking on this, but it means that each of us, from birth to death, every living creature from birth to death is defining the evolutionary process by every decision that he or she makes. And so in epigenetics and developmental biology, they're understanding that it's not just, evolution isn't just defined by the moment of birth and the moment of death, right, and your genetic inheritance, but every single decision you make. So this ties into psychology, and with respect to the third story, it means that, and this is, I think, extending Raphael's comment, that we are all in the story, and so we are all telling the story, and rather than, broadcasting out. Thank you.
I recently finished a very nice project together with a number of my collaborators, a project funded by the Templeton Foundation called The Origin of Goal-Directedness. And that was the idea that in traditional science, goal-directedness is kind of taboo. Things happen either deterministically or randomly, but they are not moving towards a goal. But if you look at biological organisms, they're very clearly goal-directed. And so what we did in the project, I'm not going to go into any details, is to show that self-organization can create systems that are goal-directed, that means that they intervene in their own further evolution. They're not just passively. It's like the example I often use of the billiard ball. The billiard ball gets hit and it just moves wherever the cue pushes it. It's passive, it's inert. Organisms are goal-directed, they're autonomous, they have agencies, they don't let themselves being pushed. They will, for themselves, intervene and they will change their own environment, so-called niche construction. They will change their own evolution.